Given the Prime Minister's aspirations, a big winner from yesterday's budget was always going to be infrastructure. I spoke earlier to Brendan Lyon, Chief Executive of Infrastructure Partnerships Australia, who's been looking at just how good a hand the sector has been dealt. Brendan Lyon, thank you for joining me.
Great to be with you.
Now, we're told, I think it's the equivalent of 8 Snowy Mountain schemes. This infrastructure splurge, is it as good as you were hoping for?
Look, it's certainly the largest infrastructure commitment we've ever seen in terms of national funding for major infrastructure projects. We've had a careful look through the budget papers and it looks like there's $9 billion of additional funding.
Well, that was one of my questions. Is that new money? $9
billion in new money, bringing the total program to about $50 billion in terms of what the Commonwealth has committed to invest, $41 billion or so over the next 4 years. So a very substantial program, a very substantial commitment, and really shows the benefit of starting to reorder some of the fiscal priorities to invest in the sort of projects that will grow the economy and safeguard jobs.
You say $41 billion over the 4 years. Much of the new money doesn't kick in until after the forward estimates, doesn't it?
Around $9 billion over the forward estimates in additional funding over what was committed on the last budget settings. That is the new money. The government are using a larger figure, but that runs out to year 7. What we've done is have a look at what's actually in the budget itself, what's committed in terms of funding. So we're seeing a $9 billion additional commitment to transport infrastructure projects over the next 4 years. Very much a reaction, I think, to both the significant shortfalls and costs, but also the retreat we're seeing in terms of the mining capital investment and the impact that would have unaddressed in terms of broader economic activity.
Seems to be a lot of emphasis on road rather than rail and I guess therefore public transport. Is that really a good thing?
Look, I think the federal government should be looking to invest in the sort of things that are going to grow its own revenue, because that means that it's putting its infrastructure commitments, if it's growing its own fiscal return, it means that it's investing in the sort of infrastructure that's growing economic activity and providing that long tail productivity benefit. So I think a focus on sorting out road transport in terms of major capital cities is important, but there's also some very significant gains to be made in terms of investments in smaller projects on the national freight network. Things like replacing timber bridges so you can cut sometimes hundreds of kilometres out of the journey for freight moving down to ports and cities and so forth. They're very high productivity investments, relatively easy to get moving because the scale is less. And so I think we do need to see a real focus on those sort of investments out of this program as well.
Presumably, a lot of this funding requires match funding from the states?
Look, certainly the structure of the budget last night was intelligent in the way that it puts an incentive on the table for states to start sorting out their own budget strategies, particularly the incentive payments that sit around the privatisation of public assets.
Yes.
The Commonwealth can't replace states. States will always have a central role in funding, regulating and providing infrastructure. So I think the focus on how you catalyse increased...
I'm just wondering how this is going to go, because that asset recycling program, that $5 billion, is largely a redirection of the Building Australia Fund, the Education Investment Fund, and the government's also taking, what, $80 billion out of state funding for schools and hospitals. So the states are going to be scrabbling around for money. I mean, do you think they're really going to be able to match a lot of these projects?
Look, I mean, states are cash poor. They're politically overcommitted to infrastructure. They're under-resourced in terms of budget capacity to be able to deliver them. That's why I think it is smart for the national government to look at how can you incentivise these states which are asset-rich in terms of things like major electricity networks on the East Coast, in terms of seaports, a whole range of assets where existing taxpayer money can be liberated, it can be used to bring down the debt on the budget and start to fund the capital investments that are needed to grow the economy.
As a Commonwealth incentive for the states, whereas I was sort of looking at it as wondering whether the Commonwealth was going to get the other half of its funding done.
Yeah, I think it's unashamedly about trying to get the states back into a position where they can routinely fund their own infrastructure priorities. I think that's very important. I mean, New South Wales and Queensland would both strengthen their funding position by about $50 billion each. So you could really start to transform your city, start to invest in the freight infrastructure investments, in the urban rail projects and other things. But we need to face up to the fact that we can't continue to have structural deficits and high debt loads on states and expect them to be able to fund the infrastructure that's needed. So I think it's smart to look at how do you catalyse states to start having these complex discussions with the public about why we need to change existing settings, how it's done and the benefits and the challenges and trade-offs that might exist.
Brendan, there has been criticism of a lack of rigour in the cost-benefit analysis behind some of these projects. And in fact, it's something the Productivity Commission raised recently. And I noticed that, WestConnex in Sydney and East West Connect in Melbourne are both being announced before Infrastructure Australia has really given them the green light.
Look, this issue around how do you select the right projects and bring them forward to maximise the efficiency of what you are doing with the obviously very limited money that's available for infrastructure is a really important one, and we were certainly quite involved with the Productivity Commission and a range of other processes around it. But one of the problems we've got is we're expecting a relatively unsophisticated and simple tool in terms of the benefit-cost ratio to make very sophisticated decisions. So one of the things that we would like to see, and we testified to the Productivity Commission around this, is the development of a much more robust and rigorous set of assessment tools so that you're able to trade off the relative priorities around the different investments that you might be able to make.
So you're looking for more transparency because you obviously represent your members as an industry peak body, but Infrastructure Australia, the government's advisory body, its chief last year left because he was concerned about the independence of that body.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think Infrastructure Australia itself has got a lot of work to do in terms of the assessment framework that it uses, because while it's relatively scientific but simple in its direct benefit cost assumptions and methodologies, the way that it measures and puts into place consideration around social, environmental and other factors that drive these sort of investments is relatively arbitrary. It sees a number between 0 and 5 added in, and I mean we know
so
that.
So if you think if there was a bit more transparency in the way they did that, then there'd be less opportunity for a minister to perhaps use a bit more discretion, because there's a lot of pressure on to get these projects out, isn't there?
I think the more that you can get transparency around the decision making for major investments, the more the community will come with governments in terms of the broader reform of budgets, the case for investments, and the more that you will see a genuine flow of money into the right sort of projects without regard for geographic or political bias. So, I mean, we would argue that you should have full transparency around the allocation of public funding into projects, but it's not as simple as loading in a whole bunch of assumptions and the answer spits out the other end. It's not as simple as a pass-fail. Yep. There's a whole range of things that you need to consider around the environmental impacts, around the social benefits and costs, as well as the economic considerations. So we need to do a lot more work if we're going to make the best of the investments we do fund.
Finally, when are we going to see some traction from this investment, both on the productivity side and the employment side?
Look, I think the productivity benefits that we're wanting are going to accrue with a very long tail. I mean, this is really about bringing down the deadweight costs in terms of the supply chain, making our manufacturing sectors, our agricultural sectors, better able to compete by getting rid of these deadweight supply chain costs. In terms of the stimulatory impact, I think the Treasury are very concerned about the period we're coming into, particularly 2015-16, because of the retreat and the very rapid retreat we're seeing in terms of the mining capital investment. So I think there's going to be a mix of drivers sitting around the allocation and expenditure of these very substantial funds that were made available last night. And that's where things like the decision-making tools, like the procurement models become important, so that you...
And what about employment?
I mean, the employment benefits are going to be immediate in terms of the projects hitting the ground, but also, I mean, the most substantial employment benefits you're going to get are from the stimulatory, the long-run stimulatory impact you get in terms of increased economic activity around these corridors. The M7 in Western Sydney is a great example where a whole range of industries sprung up because of the investment in that motorway project. So if we're going to grow the economy, I think we do need to be honest that we need to invest in roads, in freight rail, as well as mass transit projects, and that's where we'll see the country start to get ahead.
Brendan Lyon, thank you very much for joining me.
Great to be with you.
Fantastic. Great.
Getting a tape check.